I was already standing when the first wave of data hit the main display. 800 red signatures bloomed across the holoscreen like ink dropped into water, each one moving with the kind of steady, unhurried purpose that only something enormous and confident can manage. The room around me changed instantly. I could feel it before I could see it. 40 alien officers, each representing a species that had been sailing the stars for centuries longer than my own, went completely still. I am Commander Yusuf Adeyemi. I have been in difficult rooms before. Rooms where the air felt like it was being slowly pressed out by the weight of what everyone knew but no one would say. This was one of those rooms, except this time the weight was not coming from the inside. It was coming from the stars. 1,412 Vreth vessels, the sensor operator said. His voice was flat and practiced. The kind of voice a person uses when they have trained themselves not to panic. But the training is working very hard right now. Confirmed FTL drop, bearing Mark 7, closing at standard Vreth assault speed. Estimated contact range in 71 hours. Admiral Voron, the Supreme Commander of the Galactic Empire's Third Combined Arm, stood at the center of the bridge with his 4 upper limbs folded across his chest. He was a Selthari, tall and silver gray, with wide eyes that could track 6 separate screens at once without moving his head. He had fought in 11 wars. He had never lost a fleet engagement. Right now he looked like a man who was doing the mathematics in his head and not liking the answer. The Empire could field approximately 300 warships before the Vreth reached the inner system. 300 against 1,412. Every officer on that bridge knew those numbers. Nobody said them out loud. There was no point. I stood near the rear observation rail, where they had placed me when I first came aboard. The position was polite but deliberate, far enough from the command center that I could be ignored when needed. Close enough to observe everything. I was the only human being on the flagship. And at that moment I was the least important person in the room, which suited me perfectly. I had been attached to the Eternal Senate 6 weeks earlier as a liaison observer. That was the official title. The Empire's diplomatic office had processed my credentials with all the enthusiasm of someone filing a parking form. The officer who reviewed my entry file had actually laughed, quietly, when he saw my species designation. Not unkindly. More the way a person laughs when they find something unexpectedly charming. Like a child trying to carry a bag that is too heavy for them. Earth's official entry in the Galactic Registry read, Pre-warp observation subject, designation 7740, status, passive survey, threat level, negligible, cultural development index, early industrial to early space age, estimated time to galactic readiness, 400 to 600 years. That file had not been updated in 43 years. Nobody had thought to update it, because nobody had thought about Earth at all. That is the thing about being classified as harmless. You stop being watched. And when you stop being watched, you become free to do whatever you want. Admiral Voron turned from the main display and looked at his senior staff. His voice was calm and very quiet, which in my experience means a commander is either completely in control or working very hard to appear that way. All reserve formations to battle stations. Signal the Senate Council. Begin emergency mobilization of the 2nd and 4th Arm. He paused. Calculate projected intercept points. His chief strategist, a Marin named Counselor Drath, began pulling up tactical overlays immediately. Drath was brilliant. I had watched him work for 6 weeks and I had enormous respect for him. He could see patterns in fleet movements the way a musician hears harmonics. He began laying out the Empire's best possible formation responses, and every one of them had the same quiet problem. There were not enough ships. We can create a layered defensive screen here, Drath said, highlighting a region between the gas giant and the inner asteroid belt. If we consolidate the Senate Guard and the reserve patrol groups, we can bring our total to 340 vessels. With fortified position advantages and the gravity well of the giant as a tactical anchor, our models suggest a 41% probability of holding the line long enough for reinforcements from the outer systems. 41%. In other rooms, that might sound like reasonable odds. In this room, looking at those numbers, it sounded like what it was. Several officers began speaking at once. One of the Keth representatives wanted to know why the outer system reinforcements had not already been called. A senior Marin fleet captain argued that the layered screen was too spread and would collapse under saturation fire. A Selthari logistics officer was already calculating fuel reserves and repair capacity. I leaned against the observation rail and watched them work. They were good at their jobs. Every one of them. The Empire had centuries of institutional knowledge, battle doctrine refined across dozens of wars, equipment that was genuinely excellent. They were not incompetent. They were not even outmatched in the traditional sense. They were just missing a variable. I reached into the inner pocket of my uniform jacket and took out a small comm unit. It was a personal device, not linked to the ship's network, running on a frequency that the Empire's communication systems had never been programmed to monitor, because the frequency had never existed in their records. I typed 11 characters, a system coordinate string and 4 words. They need us. Now I pressed send. Then I put the comm unit back in my pocket, folded my arms and went back to watching. Counselor Drath noticed me at some point during the 3rd hour of planning. Most of the initial panic had settled into the harder, quieter work of doing the best you can with what you have. Drath walked over to me during a brief recess while the Admiral was taking a private channel call from the Senate Council. "Commander Adeyemi," he said. He always pronounced my name correctly, which I appreciated. "I have to ask, your people, Earth, is there any possibility of assistance? Any military capability that could be mobilized in time?" He asked the question with genuine curiosity, but also with a kind of careful gentleness, the way you might ask a child if they have any toys that could help with a problem that is very clearly too large for toys. I looked at him for a moment. "Earth has been paying close attention to galactic affairs for a long time," I said. "We have been watching the Vreth expand for decades. We have been watching the Empire's defensive postures. We understand the strategic picture." Drath nodded slowly. "That is encouraging. But I mean, practically speaking, do you have ships, weapons, some resources?" I said. He waited for me to say more. I did not say more. He studied my face with those quick Marin eyes, trying to read something there, and I gave him nothing to read. After a moment, he went back to the tactical table. I checked the time on my comm unit, not the message screen, just the clock. Then I got myself a cup of coffee from the dispenser in the corner of the bridge, because the coffee on the Eternal Senate was actually excellent, and I drank it slowly while the Empire's finest minds planned a defense they quietly suspected was not going to be enough. The thing I have always found interesting about being underestimated is how comfortable it is. People leave you alone. They do not ask difficult questions. They do not demand explanations. They file you under a simple label, and then move on to things they consider more important. Earth had been filed under that label for 43 years. And for 43 years we had been perfectly, gratefully invisible. The Galactic Registry had logged our world as a curiosity, a small blue planet circling an unremarkable star in a quiet corner of the outer arm. The species on it was young and noisy and passionate, and occasionally very foolish, and by every standard the Empire used to measure such things, we were centuries away from mattering. Those standards, it turned out, measured the wrong things. They measured formal development, official announcements, registered technology programs, and declared military expenditures. The kind of progress that gets logged in databases, because the species doing it wants to be known, wants to be counted, wants to take its place at the galactic table. We did not want any of those things, not yet, not until we chose to. In the 39th year after first contact, when the Empire's survey probe made its routine pass over our solar system, and logged its routine report confirming that Earth remained a pre-warp observation subject, with no significant developments, 47 human engineers in a facility beneath the Nevada desert were assembling the 4th prototype of a faster-than-light transit drive. They had not told anyone. There was no press release. There was no diplomatic signal to the Empire. There was just the work, done quietly, done carefully, in the dark. We had always been good at working in the dark. Back on the bridge, Admiral Voren called the room to attention. The private channel call from the Senate Council had apparently not gone well. His expression, already composed, had become something harder and more still. "The Council has authorized full emergency mobilization. All available forces are to converge on the defense line. Every registered ally has been contacted." He paused. "Response times from Allied fleets range from 9 days to 4 weeks. The Vreth will reach us in 71 hours. The math was not complicated. Nobody did it out loud. I finished my coffee. Outside the great forward viewport of the Eternal Senate, the stars were steady and cold and beautiful. Somewhere out there, beyond the range of every sensor on this ship, beyond every frequency the Empire monitored, a message had arrived at its destination. And somewhere out there, something very large and very quiet had begun to move. I set my coffee cup down on the ledge of the observation rail. I was not worried. I want to be clear about that. I was not calm because I was pretending, or because I had trained myself not to feel fear. I was calm because I knew something that everyone else in this room did not know. We were not alone out here. We never had been. We had just been waiting for the right moment to say so. I pulled out my comm unit one more time, not to send anything, just to check the clock. 68 hours remaining before the Vreth reached firing range. I looked at the number, then put the unit away. Plenty of time. In the 43rd year after first contact, a Vreth scout vessel made a navigational error near the edge of our system, and drifted close enough to Jupiter's outer moons that our early warning network caught it. It was unmanned, automated, part of a long-range survey pattern the Vreth used to map resource-rich systems. It hit a debris field from one of our older mining operations and came down in pieces across a stretch of open space near Callisto. We recovered it in 11 days. Nobody outside a specific group of 230 people ever knew it had been there. Those 230 people spent the next 9 years taking it apart. I was not among them. I was 15 years old when that scout came down. Growing up in Lagos, studying mathematics and building terrible model rockets in the backyard of my family's house. I had no idea any of it was happening. Most people on Earth had no idea. That was entirely deliberate. The program had a name that was never spoken in any official document. Internally, the people who worked on it called it the Quiet. Because that was what it required. Absolute quiet. No press, no announcements, no diplomatic signals, no entries in any registry that could be accessed by outside eyes. The Vreth had given us a machine, and we were going to learn everything it knew, and we were going to do it in total silence. By the time I was 24 and beginning my military career, the Quiet had already produced 3 functional reverse-engineered components of Vreth drive technology. By the time I was 30 and serving as a junior navigation officer on one of Earth's first deep space patrol vessels, the Quiet had 17 fully operational warships. Not registered, not announced, not visible on any galactic survey, ghost ships. That was what we called them among ourselves. Not dramatically, just practically. Ships that existed outside every record, every frequency, every database in the known galaxy. We had built them to be invisible from the beginning. Not by accident, but because we had decided very early on that our first real appearance in galactic affairs was going to be on our terms, at a moment of our choosing. In a situation where our presence could make an actual difference. We are an impatient species in many ways. We rush into things. We argue constantly. We change our minds and then change them back. But when we decide to be patient, when we commit to waiting, we can be extraordinarily, almost frighteningly patient. 43 years of quiet preparation. 43 years of building something that nobody knew existed. I joined the UN Deep Space Expeditionary Corps at 26. I spent 8 years on patrol and survey work. Some of it in genuine galactic contact zones. Some of it in the quiet outer regions where the Empire's traffic was thin. I learned 4 alien languages. I studied Vreth battle doctrine. Partly from intercepted signals, partly from the Empire's own historical records, which were surprisingly open to registered liaison officers once you had the credentials. I learned how they thought, how they approached an engagement, what they expected from an enemy, and what they were not prepared to find. I also spent a great deal of time during those years aboard training exercises with the Quiet Fleet. By the time I was assigned to the Eternal Senate as a liaison observer, the fleet numbered 804 vessels. Not all of them were the same class. We had everything from fast light interceptors designed for rapid attack passes, to heavy assault platforms built around the kinetic lance clusters that our engineers had developed over 2 decades of patient refinement. The kinetic lance cluster was not a glamorous weapon. In a galaxy full of plasma drives, particle beams, and quantum frequency disruptors, a weapon that was essentially a very large, very precisely calculated package of dense projectiles, moving at a significant fraction of light speed looked primitive on paper. The Vreth would certainly think so. The Empire would think so too. That was perfectly fine with us. The cluster worked because of mathematics. Not the mathematics of raw power, but the mathematics of timing, spacing, and saturation. Every known point defense system in the galaxy operated on the same basic principle. Detect an incoming projectile, calculate its trajectory, intercept it before it reaches the hull. It was a solved problem. The Empire's ships used it. The Vreth used it. Everyone used it, and it worked. As long as the number of incoming projectiles was within a range that the defense system could process. Our engineers had spent 20 years studying exactly where that range ended. The kinetic lance cluster was designed to exceed it, not by a little, by a factor large enough that no known point defense system, not the Vreth variant, not the Empire's standard installation, not any upgrade either of them had fielded in the last 30 years, could handle it. We did not try to penetrate their shields with power. We overwhelmed their processing capacity with volume. It was, when you reduced it to its simplest terms, a solution built on the observation that every defense system in the galaxy had been designed to fight the kinds of enemies already in the galaxy. We were not that kind of enemy. On the bridge of the Eternal Senate, Admiral Voran had begun working through the final positioning of his 340 ships. I watched the tactical overlay update in real time, the Empire's forces spreading into a layered screen formation that was genuinely well conceived. If the numbers had been anything close to even, it might have worked beautifully. Voran was good. Drath was better. The plan they had built together was the best possible plan available to them with the resources they had. It was also going to fail, I did not say this. There was nothing to be gained by saying it, and it would have required an explanation I was not yet ready to give. Instead I watched. and listened, and occasionally answered questions from junior officers who wanted to know if Earth had any advanced medical technology they could offer in the aftermath, which was the level at which most of them were thinking about my species. The Vreth fleet was now 60 hours out. At around the 40-hour mark, something changed in the way the room felt. Not a new alarm, not a new piece of data. Just a shift in the air. The way a room feels when people have been working at maximum concentration for a long time, and the edge of exhaustion starts to show. Officers who had been sharp and crisp began moving a little more slowly. Conversations dropped in volume. The tactical discussions became quieter and more precise, which is what happens when people stop performing confidence and start doing the real work of facing something difficult. Counselor Drath came to stand beside me at the observation rail again. "You have been very calm throughout all of this," he said. "I have been thinking," I said. "About what?" "About timing," I said. He looked at me carefully. Drath was one of the sharpest minds I had ever encountered in any species, and he did not miss things. He had not missed the way I had not answered his earlier question. He had not missed the fact that I had spent several quiet moments with a personal comm unit that was not connected to any system he could monitor. He was putting things together. "Commander," he said quietly, so that only I could hear, "is there something you know that we do not know?" I looked at him for a long moment. "There is a great deal that I know that you do not know," I said honestly. "Most of it, I think, is going to become apparent relatively soon." He stared at me. "How soon?" I checked my comm unit, not the message screen, the clock. "About 27 hours, I said. He opened his mouth to ask something else, and at that exact moment the long-range sensor array triggered a secondary alert. Not the Vreth. The Vreth were still on the same bearing, still closing at the same speed. This was something different. A new set of contacts, coming from the direction of the outer system. The sensor operator's voice, when it came, had a quality I had not heard in it before. Not quite panic. Something more like the voice of a person who is looking at something that does not fit any category they have been trained to process. "Admiral, I have contacts on the long-range array, bearing 37 Mark 9, coming from the outer system." A pause. "They are not transmitting identification codes. They are not on any registered frequency. They are not in our traffic database." Another pause longer. "They are not in the Galactic registry." The room went very quiet. Admiral Vorin turned slowly from the tactical display. "How many contacts?" The sensor operator checked his board 3 times before answering. 812, sir." Nobody spoke for 4 full seconds. Then everyone spoke at once. I stood at the observation rail with my arms folded and watched the controlled panic spread across the bridge of the most powerful warship in the Galactic Empire. Officers pulled up identification algorithms and ran them twice, 3 times, finding nothing. The Empire's central database was queried. The Galactic Registry was cross-referenced. Every known species file was checked and checked again. Nothing. Not one match, not a partial match. Not even a classification for the drive signatures, which did not correspond to any known propulsion type in the records. I heard someone across the bridge whisper something about the unnamed, a mythological precursor species that appeared occasionally in fringe academic discussions and late-night conversations among junior officers. Nobody actually believed they existed. But when your sensor board shows 800 ships with no identifiable origin, your mind reaches for something. I said nothing. I watched. I was aware that Counselor Drath had turned to look at me, and I was aware that his expression had moved a considerable distance from the careful, polite neutrality he had maintained for 6 weeks. He was not angry. He was something closer to stunned, with the beginning of something else underneath it that might, in time, become a kind of quiet respect. The Vreth Battle Marshal's hail came through on all frequencies, a deep, grinding, translated voice, carrying the particular tone of something very large that is not used to being surprised and does not enjoy the experience. "Unknown vessels, you are entering an active combat zone. Identify yourselves immediately. Identify your species, your fleet designation, and your authorization to operate in this sector. Failure to respond will be treated as hostile action." The bridge of the Eternal Senate went completely still. 812 unknown ships, no identification, no records. No response to the Vreth demand. Then, after exactly 5 seconds of silence, the response came. It came in a language that no one else on that bridge had ever heard. Plain, direct, with the flat calm of a person who has arrived where they intended to arrive and sees no reason to raise their voice about it. Then the translation system caught up, and the words appeared on the main display. "This is Admiral Grace Whitmore, United Nations Deep Space Expeditionary Corps, Reserve Arm. We are here on behalf of our friends. We suggest you reconsider your current course." I uncrossed my arms. I straightened my uniform jacket. I looked at Counselor Drath, who was staring at me with those quick, clever Marin eyes. And I think in that moment he understood everything, or at least enough of everything to understand the shape of what was about to happen. "The records," I said quietly. are going to need updating. The first Vreth commander to realize what was happening was not the one issuing orders. It was a junior tactical officer on one of the forward Vreth destroyers, a vessel whose name translated roughly as the Relentless Forward, which tells you something about Vreth naming conventions. His name has never been recorded in any source I have seen, but according to the after-action reconstruction that our own intelligence teams assembled later from recovered Vreth communications, he was the first one to correctly identify what the incoming contacts represented and what their formation suggested. He reported it up his chain of command. His chain of command ignored him for 11 minutes, which is an extremely costly 11 minutes when 800 ships are closing at combat speed from behind your position. I was watching the tactical display on the Eternal Senate's bridge when the human fleet made its first move, and even knowing it was coming, even having spent years in training exercises observing similar maneuvers from the inside, the sight of it from the outside, rendered on the Empire's sensor display, was something I had not quite been prepared for. They did not charge. That would have been the expected thing, the dramatic thing. 800 ships accelerating toward a 1,400-ship enemy force in a straight line would have made a certain kind of sense that any galactic military mind could have categorized and responded to. Charge met with countercharge, formation against formation, the kind of engagement that battle doctrine is built to handle. Instead, the human fleet fractured, not because of disorder or confusion, because that was the plan. 812 ships split into 41 separate engagement groups, each one moving on a different vector, each one at a different speed, each one targeting a different section of the Vreth formation. The Vreth tactical systems, which were excellent and well-maintained and had been refined across generations of fleet engagements, began calculating intercept solutions for each group independently. That was what they were designed to do. Identify threats, calculate responses, engage. The problem was that the 41 groups were not operating independently. They were coordinated. Every move that one group made was designed to affect the tactical calculations of the Vreth response to every other group. When groups have accelerated and forced the Vreth left flank to reposition, it created a corridor that Group 22 had already been moving to exploit. When Group 14 swung wide on a long arc that looked like a retreat, it was actually pre-positioning for a firing solution that would not exist for another 6 minutes, at which point it would exist for exactly 40 seconds, and Group 14 would use all 40 of them. Counselor Drath stood at the tactical display with his mouth slightly open. I had never seen Drath with his mouth open. He was not a demonstrative person. He processed information internally and showed very little of it externally. Right now he was showing a great deal. They are not using any known formation doctrine, he said. Not to me specifically, more to the room in general. No, I said. We developed our own. He turned to look at me. Over what period of time? 40 years of theoretical work. About 15 years of practical refinement. He looked back at the display. The Vreth formation, which had been a tight, well-organized assault column designed to punch through a defensive line, was beginning to show the first signs of what happens to a tight formation when it is being attacked from 41 different directions simultaneously. It does not collapse instantly. It pulls, it folds in some places and stretches in others. Gaps appear. The command structure tries to compensate, which means the command ships are using processing capacity to manage internal coherence that they should be using to manage the engagement. Admiral Voran had come to stand on the other side of the display from me. He watched the sensor readout with the expression of a man who has spent his entire life studying war, and is watching something that is simultaneously familiar and completely outside his experience. The coordination, he said quietly. How are they maintaining it across that many independent groups at that distance? Our own fleet communication systems would have a 14-second lag at those dispersal angles. Ours does not have that lag, I said. He looked at me. We developed a different approach to fleet communication, I said. Tight beam relay between designated coordination ships with predictive buffering. The individual group commanders know the full plan in advance and have authorization to deviate from it as conditions change, but within a framework that was built to remain coherent even with significant deviation. We call it loose spine doctrine. Voran was quiet for a moment. Loose spine, he repeated. Rigid enough to maintain coordination, flexible enough to adapt in real time. No single point of failure in the command structure. He looked back at the display. On it, the Vreth formation was continuing its painful, gradual unraveling, like a piece of cloth being pulled in too many directions at once. The Vreth were not panicking. I want to be clear about that. They were professionals, and they responded to each new threat with discipline and speed. But discipline and speed applied to the wrong problem does not solve the right one. And the problem the Vreth were trying to solve, how to respond to 41 coordinated threats using tactical doctrine built for handling a single advancing enemy, was the wrong problem. The right problem was the kinetic lances. The first full salvo came from groups 3, 9, and 17 simultaneously, targeted at a cluster of Vreth heavy assault platforms on the right flank. A kinetic lance cluster salvo, at the volumes our ships fired, looks on a sensor display like a sudden dense cloud of contacts. Hundreds of individual projectiles moving in slightly different trajectories, all aimed at the same general region of space, but distributed across it in a precise mathematical pattern. The Vreth point defense systems came online instantly, as they were designed to, and began calculating intercept solutions, as they were designed to. The point defense systems were very good. They neutralized 61% of the incoming projectiles. This sounds impressive until you understand that 61% of a kinetic lance salvo still leaves a large number of projectiles that the point defense system has processed to the edge of its capacity, and has nothing left to give for. The 3 Vreth heavy assault platforms on the right flank were hit simultaneously. They did not explode dramatically. They were simply no longer functional. The room on the Eternal Senate's bridge was silent. Then Drath said, in a voice that was entirely flat and entirely precise, "Their point defense processing limit is being exceeded." "Yes," I said. "The lance clusters are designed specifically to exceed it." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "How long have you known the Vreth point defense processing limit?" "We have been modeling it for about 18 years, I said. "We confirmed the specific threshold from the scout vessel we recovered near Jupiter." Vorin turned to look at me. Very slowly, "The scout vessel near Jupiter, 26 years ago," I said. "It drifted into our outer system and was damaged in a debris field. We recovered the wreckage. You reported that to no one." "We reported it to ourselves," I said. "Extensively." He looked at me for a long time. There was no anger in his expression. There was something I found harder to read. Something that might have been a mixture of professional admiration and the slightly unsettled feeling that comes from realizing that a situation you thought you understood fully had dimensions you had missed entirely. The battle continued. I am not going to describe every engagement in sequence, partly because there were hundreds of them, and partly because the shape of the thing was established in the first 20 minutes. And what followed was essentially the confirmation of that shape at scale. The human fleet never stopped moving. It never consolidated into a static position that the Vreth could fix a targeting solution on. It never did the expected thing at the expected moment. Every time the Vreth tactical systems made a prediction about what Group 14 or Group 27 or Group 39 was going to do, the prediction was wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not randomly wrong, but consistently, purposefully, precisely wrong in ways that cost the Vreth 2 to 3 minutes of recalculation each time. 2 to 3 minutes is a long time in a fleet engagement. At the 40-minute mark, the Vreth formation had lost 219 vessels. Our fleet had lost 4. 3 of those 4 were deliberate ships that had been positioned as what our doctrine called expendable anchors, drawing Vreth fire to create the corridor that Group 31 needed to execute a particular sequence. The 4th was a genuine loss, a fast interceptor that caught a full-power Vreth plasma salvo from an angle that the crew did not have time to correct for. I learned later that the ship's name was the Careful Hope, and that all 41 people aboard were from a station in the outer asteroid belt. I noted that, and I note it now, because a story like this one is easy to tell in a way that makes the numbers clean and the outcome inevitable, and it was neither of those things. It was won by people who chose to be there, and some of them did not come home. At the 55-minute mark, the Vreth Battle Marshal issued a fleet-wide withdrawal order. It was not a rout. The Vreth were too disciplined for a rout. They pulled back in organized stages, covering each other's retreat, maintaining coherence. They were still dangerous. They would remain dangerous for some time. But they were leaving, and the direction they were leaving was away. And they were not going to stop until they were somewhere they could reassess what had just happened to them and figure out what the entry in their own records needed to say about it. At the 58-minute mark, the human fleet reformed. 808 ships. Tight, clean formation. No dramatic posturing, no victory signals, no aggressive advance toward the Empire's position. They simply stopped where they were and held position, engines on standby, weapons cold, waiting. Admiral Vorin stood at the center of his bridge and looked at the sensor display for a long time. Then he looked at me. 4 losses, he said. 4, I confirmed. Against 1,412. They withdrew with approximately 840 still operational, I said. We do not count a withdrawal as a complete solution. But for the immediate situation, yes, he was quiet. Then, in 58 minutes. 58 minutes and 20 seconds, I said. Because our people had been keeping precise time. Vorin looked back at the display. The human fleet sat there, steady and patient, every ship in exact position, not moving, not signaling, not demanding anything. Just present. They are waiting, Vorin said. Yes. For what? I looked at the display. Out there, on 808 ships, were people who had spent years preparing for this moment without ever knowing if it would come, without any guarantee that the galaxy would ever need them or want them, or recognize what they had built. They had done it anyway. They had stayed quiet, stayed patient, stayed invisible, and when the moment arrived, they had come without being asked twice. They are waiting to be acknowledged, I said. They are not asking for it. They would wait indefinitely, but it would mean something to them. Vorin was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached forward and opened a channel. The Senate's emergency chamber was the largest room I had ever been in. The ceiling rose 40 meters above the circular floor, ringed by tier after tier of observation galleries, each one filled with delegates and officials and aides, who had been pulled from whatever they were doing when the emergency signal went out. The chamber was designed to hold 8,000 people. It was holding close to 12,000, counting the galleries, and the noise before the session was called to order was a physical presence in the air, a layered sound built from dozens of languages and twice as many emotional states. I stood on the floor of the chamber in the central delegate ring, which was where the actual speaking happened. I was not supposed to be here. Earth did not have a delegate seat. Earth was not a member of the galactic community in any formal sense. Earth was, officially, still pre-warp observation subject 7714, except that designation had been quietly removed from the active registry, sometime in the last 6 hours when someone in the classification office had looked at the battle sensor data and decided that whatever Earth was, it was not that anymore. The problem was that no one knew what category to put us in. The system had no field for what had just happened. Every existing membership tier, associate world, protectorate, allied sovereign, full member state, was defined in terms of development timelines and registration histories and formal contact protocols that Earth had never participated in. We had not applied for anything. We had not filed any documents. We had simply shown up with 800 ships and prevented an invasion. The classification system was, apparently, having a considerable amount of trouble with this. I had been invited to the chamber floor by Admiral Vorin, who had spoken with the Senate Council for 2 hours before the session opened. I did not know exactly what had been said in those conversations. I knew the outcome, because Vorin had come to find me in the liaison quarters aboard the Eternal Senate and told me, with the particular expression of a man delivering news that he finds both complicated and deeply interesting, "The Council wishes to hear from you directly." So here I was. The Council President, a very old Selthari, named First Speaker Avith, called the chamber to order with a tone rod that emitted a frequency just below human hearing, but clearly registered by every other species in the room. Because the noise dropped almost instantly. Avith had been serving on the council for 60 years. She had presided over 3 major crises and 2 wars. She was not easily moved by events. She had, however, spent the last several hours reviewing some sensor data from the engagement, and when she looked at me from the raised council bench, there was something in her expression that I would describe as careful reassessment. She began with the formal acknowledgement. The Vreth fleet had withdrawn. The immediate threat to the inner system had been neutralized. The Senate extended its formal recognition to the unidentified Allied force for their intervention, and requested formal identification and diplomatic contact at the earliest convenience. Then she looked at me. "Commander Adeyemi, you are, I understand, the representative of the people who intervened today." "I am a representative," I said. "I would not claim to speak for all of humanity, but I can speak to what happened and why." "Please do." I had thought about what I was going to say. I had thought about it in the quiet of the liaison quarters during the hours after the battle, and I had thought about it on the way to the chamber, and I had thought about it standing here, while the noise of 12,000 beings settled into silence. I had thought about making it eloquent, or precise, or formally diplomatic. In the end, I said what I actually meant, in plain words, the way my mother had always told me to say things. 60 years ago, the Empire's survey team logged our world as a primitive observation subject and moved on. We understood why. By your measures, we were behind, young, undeveloped. We did not argue with the classification. We accepted it, and we used the time it gave us. I paused. We are a species that does not like being told what we cannot do. We also do not like watching something terrible happen when we have the means to prevent it. Those 2 things together are, I think, a reasonably complete description of what you saw today. The chamber was very quiet. We did not ask for recognition. We did not announce ourselves. We did not file applications or petition for status or wait for permission. We built what we thought we would need. We paid attention, and when the moment came, we came. That is what humans do. It is, I think, what we have always done. First Speaker Avith looked at me for a long moment before speaking. "And what does Earth want in return?" This was the question. I could see it in every face around the chamber floor. Every delegate, every observer, every being in those tiered galleries above me, who was watching and translating and trying to understand. Because in galactic affairs, nothing like this happens without a price. Intervention means negotiation, assistance means debt, power means leverage. These were the rules of the galactic community as it had always operated, and every person in this was waiting to hear what leverage humanity was about to apply. I had spoken with Admiral Grace Whitmore twice since the battle ended, on the same private frequency that had carried my message 27 hours ago. Whitmore was the kind of commander who said exactly what she meant in the fewest words that would carry the meaning accurately. She had given me her answer to this question in 11 words, and I had agreed with every one of them. No special status, I said, no exclusive arrangements, no tribute, no territory, no debt. One thing only, I looked at Aeth directly. A seat at every war council this body convenes. No veto by senior species. Earth will attend, will contribute our assessment, and will participate in decisions that affect the safety of inhabited worlds. That is all. The silence lasted a long time. Then from somewhere in the galleries above, a sound began. I could not identify which species it came from or which tier. It spread sideways and upward, and other voices joined it, some of them sounds I had never heard before from species I had never studied. But the quality of it was not difficult to understand. It was not applause in the human sense. It was something more like recognition. The sound of a very large room, full of very different beings arriving at a collective realization about something. I stood on the chamber floor and let it wash over me. Later, after the formal session had closed, and the council had approved an emergency membership resolution, that the classification officers were going to spend months figuring out how to properly record, Counselor Drath found me in one of the corridor annexes off the main floor. He stood in front of me for a moment without speaking. Then he said, 43 years, give or take, I said. You were invisible for 43 years. By choice, we were preparing, I said. There is a difference, he considered this. Most species, when they reach the capability to make themselves known, want to make themselves known. The recognition is part of the goal. Not for us, I said, not then. The goal was to be useful when it mattered. The recognition comes after, or it does not come at all. Either way, the useful thing already happened. He was quiet for a moment. You were not afraid that no moment would ever come, that you would build all of this and never need it. We were not building it in hopes of needing it, I said. We were building it so that if it was needed, we would not be found lacking. I paused. There is a difference in that too. Drath looked at me for a long time with those quick, perceptive eyes that had been trying to read me for 6 weeks, and now, finally, had something to read. I owe you an apology, he said. When you first came aboard, I thought of you as a curiosity, a diplomatic gesture, a species that would one day, perhaps, contribute something small to the community. I know, I said. I was not offended. You should have been. No, I said. We should have been better at making ourselves known. The fault was partly ours. We were so focused on staying quiet that we forgot that being invisible has its own costs. Other people plan around you, not knowing what you are. They make decisions that affect you without understanding what they are working with. I thought of the battle sensor data, of those 11 minutes when the Vreth junior officer's warning had been ignored, of the 4 ships that were not coming home. Sometimes the cost of invisibility is paid by other people. Drath nodded slowly. He seemed to be processing something large. What happens now? He asked. I thought about my daughter's message, still waiting in my personal queue, the one I had not answered yet. I thought about Admiral Whitmore's fleet, still holding position in the outer system. 808 ships full of people, who were probably eating slightly bad food from recycling units and arguing about what happened next, and feeling the particular strange mix of exhaustion and something like joy that comes after doing something difficult and important. I thought about the update being made right now in the Galactic Registry, the blank field where Earth's new classification was supposed to go. The classification officers who were going to have to make a new category because the old ones did not fit. I think, I said, that we figure out how to be known. After 43 years of quiet, that is going to take some adjustment, for us and for everyone else. But we have time. The interesting work is just beginning. I left Drath in the corridor and walked back through the ship toward the liaison quarters. The officers I passed in the corridors stepped aside, not dramatically, not with any performance of deference, just the quiet, instinctive movement that happens when people recalibrate the space around someone they have recalculated. In my quarters, I sat down and opened my personal comm unit. My daughter's message was there, time-stamped from 13 hours ago, when she had apparently woken up in the middle of her night and checked the news feeds and sent the first thing that came into her head. Dad, did you save the aliens? I looked at that for a long time. Outside the viewport of my quarters, the stars were steady. Out there, 808 ships were waiting, patient and quiet, the way we had always been good at waiting. Out there, somewhere in the deep dark, The Vreth fleet was pulling itself back together and updating its own records about what it had encountered. Out there, a galaxy that had spent 60 years looking past a small blue planet in a quiet outer system was doing the slow, important work of looking again, this time properly, for the first time. I started typing. We just reminded them they were not alone. I sent it. Then I leaned back in my chair and looked at the stars for a while, thinking about nothing in particular, which is what you do when something very large and very important has just finished and the next very large and very important thing has not quite started yet. There is a moment in between that belongs to nobody and nothing except the quiet. We have always been good at the quiet.